So where are the European economies headed? Some would say to the abyss. I refuse to take such a grim view, but it is indubitably true that a crisis is on, and it's a full-blown crisis. Why do I say so? Well, 3 points of information, or 3 pieces of news caught my fancy, or caught my attention. Number 1, the euro fell to a fresh 20-year low. Now that's very worrying. Number 2, the Eurozone debt is finding it difficult to find buyers. Trading in Eurozone debt has become almost, I wouldn't say impossible, but has become pretty difficult. So that's number 2. And number 3, Germany, the bedrock of Europe, or the bedrock of the Eurozone economy, now has over 10% inflation, which is a 70-year high. So let's dig into what's going on. Well, the Eurozone, or the euro first, the euro has fallen to a 20-year low. Why? Well, there's an energy crisis on. Why is that on? Because there's a war on, a tiny little matter on the eastern edge of Europe in a place called Ukraine. The Russia-Ukraine war has really unleashed a catastrophic energy crisis because Europe, and in particular Germany, were reliant on Russian gas. And Gazprom is not playing ball. Gazprom has decided to do maintenance. There are stockpiles for the winter, but they are not that high. As gas prices have skyrocketed and oil prices have gone up, this has caused energy costs for Europe to go up. And as the summer recedes and autumn and winter set in, it'll not just be heating costs, but also the running of factories costs, and the factories are already suffering. So on those fears, on the fears of rising inflation, and on the fears of increased uncertainty as to what happens this winter, you're seeing a downward pressure on the euro. Now, there's another tiny little matter that has been hit by this inflation crisis, and that is, of course, Eurozone debt is now in danger. Lest we forget, more than 10 years ago, there was a major crisis. It was a Eurozone debt crisis. The Greek debt crisis in particular attracted attention. What happened in the Greek debt crisis? In fact, I wrote about it, and it was the first article I wrote that did rather well. And at that time I said, European banks should have just taken a haircut. By bailing out Greece, they just kicked the can down the road. They were pretending this fiction that if they gave Greek more debt and Greece made reforms and then entered the virtuous growth spiral or growth cycle, Greece would be able to pay back all the old debt. In fact, what happened, and as the great German economist Otto von Pohl said at the time, if I remember correctly, European banks threw good money after bad. And it was taxpayer money that was used to bail out private money at risk. And that party lasted, and then came COVID, as if the Eurozone debt crisis wasn't enough. And during COVID, there was, let me remember, there was a 3.3 trillion main bond purchase scheme by the ECB, the European Central Bank. And if I remember correctly, there was another 1.7 trillion pandemic era asset purchase scheme going on. Now, these are crazy numbers, just think of it. This means the ECB was de facto printing money, left, right, and center. And this printing of money subsidized the buying of all this debt. In fact, the ECB was even buying corporate debt, corporate bonds at some point. With inflation, the ECB cannot keep printing money. That means the ECB has to do something called quantitative tightening. The era of quantitative easing is over. Quantitative easing is a simple phenomenon when you can't lower interest rates below 0%, then you start buying bonds and other assets. Now, of course, with inflation at 10% plus, the ECB has to tighten. Now, if the ECB tightens and the ECB says there's no backstop, there's no guarantee, we are not going to just willy-nilly buy any bond, then you have a dearth of buyers because buyers are nervous. At the end of the day, at the heart of the EU experiment, at the heart of the Eurozone experiment, at the heart of the Euro experiment, is this unprecedented gamble that you can have a monetary union, meaning you can have one currency, without a fiscal union. Now, when you look at the US has the dollar, and yes, you could argue that Mississippi and New York are not an optimal currency area, just as Greece and Germany are not in an optimal currency zone. But taxes from New York subsidize Mississippi. I'm not so sure in Europe the Dutch or the Germans or the more prosperous economies would like to subsidize Italy and Greece and Spain and Portugal and Ireland. And therein lies a contradiction at the heart of the Eurozone. Italian debt is not the same as German debt. And if the ECB is not going to buy up all the Italian debt, and Italy has just lost its Mario Draghi-led government, then who will? And with that withdrawal of the ECB guarantee, you have an increase in volatility, which is never good for markets. You have a decrease in liquidity, because now, of course, because it's volatile, then there are not as many buyers, which means you can't buy and sell assets as easily. And you also get an increase in borrowing costs, which means now suddenly Italy has to pay more, or Greece has to pay more interest if they want to take on more debt. So the Eurozone is in crisis and is in a deep and profound crisis. And whether it'll survive or not is an open question in the long term. In the short term, of course, tomorrow Italy is not walking out of the Eurozone, or tomorrow Greece is not walking out and adopting its own currency. Divorces are difficult, particularly when there are multiple parties involved. Now, this brings me on to the final point, which is inflation in Germany at 10%. And inflation in Germany is representative of inflation all over Europe. Inflation has hit every single European economy. In fact, it has hit Britain too, where a cost of living crisis has forced the Prime Minister out of office. And the Prime Minister forced out of office was none other than Boris Johnson, who won a commanding majority, a resounding, thumping victory, broke the Northern Red Wall in the UK. And he had to go. Yes, you could argue his scandals cost him his prime ministership. He was partying too much. He was drinking too much champagne or wine and in 10 Downing Street, breaking the lockdown rules. But really, if the economy was doing well, he'd still be in the saddle. In fact, he's still in the saddle, but only for a brief while yet. The cost of living crisis is not just about inflation. Quantitative easing did something else. Quantitative easing is basically releasing of money into the economy in the hope that the economy doesn't enter a depression. Arguably, it avoided the 1930s or 1929 style meltdown. But what it does is it pushes up asset prices. What asset prices? Shares. Therefore, stock markets start going up. Houses. Therefore, house prices start going up. And so, inadvertently, central bankers created an asset price bubble. Now, that's all very good for those who own assets. But let's say you want to buy a house. You're a first-time buyer. Let's say you're not on the property ladder. Let's say you're a renter. Let's say you are working a job and you have expenses from childcare to healthcare. Well, healthcare is covered in Europe, but still, to rent and mortgages. Well, mortgages were low, but the prices kept going up. And the point I'm making is that the cost of living crisis was partly a result of quantitative easing. And with inflation unfurling through the economy, now you'll have, or we'll have, tremendous pressures in Europe, both populist and both economic and populist. So the European economic and political model that has held so far, and that has been rather smooth for over 20 years, is now going to come increasingly under threat. Inflation is going to rock everyone's boat. The tightening or freezing, some would say, of Eurozone debt markets is going to cause immense pain, particularly to indebted countries. And of course, the falling of the euro will make everything more expensive, all the imports more expensive, and make life more difficult. It's a very difficult period ahead, and a dark winter awaits.